Hi everyone, my name is Ishika and I go to Pomona College. And today I'm going to be talking about our paper that explores user understandings of the technical terms that show up in app privacy labels. So I'm sure everyone in this room has at some point or the other seen one of these privacy policies. They show up all the time, but I'm also certain that very few people have genuinely read them. They're incredibly lengthy, packed with technical jargon, require a really high reading level to ever be understood, and thus are incredibly poorly understood by the general public. In order to remedy this problem, in December of 2020, iOS came out with the first official privacy nutrition label, and it was soon followed by Android with a similar version of it in July 2022. So the entire purpose of these labels was to be a concise, standardized version of the super lengthy privacy policies. And just like a nutrition label, it would give users an easier way to understand what exactly is being collected and shared from them in terms of their data. Although this was a significant improvement from the really long privacy policies, they still tend to be confusing, ambiguous, full of technical jargon, and are often considered to be oversimplified by users. And in our paper, we focus on the issue of the technical jargon. So in order to explore this topic, we conducted 2 studies, the first of which was qualitative. We had 46 participants and recruited them via Prolific. And in this survey, the question type was free response. Here's an example question. We gave users a screenshot of an app privacy label, and then we asked them to define each of the terms that they saw on the label in their own words and explain what they think it means. So in this case, we asked about account management and asked them to define what it means in this context. In order to analyze the data that we got from this, we conducted 2 separate analyses. One was a deductive correctness analysis, and the second was a more inductive thematic analysis. In order to analyze the correctness, we coded all of the responses as either correct, partially correct, a restate of the term itself, another way of saying I don't know, or completely wrong. For example, in the case of the account management question, the correct answer would be something that is equivalent to the developer document definition, which in this case is used for setup or management of your account with the developer. Ensuring your account is secure and you are the one using it, ensuring your information is current and correct, is an example of something that we would have coded as correct. Something like making sure you're not sharing your account with anyone else would be considered partially correct. It means to manage my account would be a restate of the term itself. Don't know would be coded as I don't know. And to keep track of areas where the app is used would be marked incorrect. And from this study, we found some interesting results. We found that 7 out of 47 of the Android terms were widely misunderstood, and 20 out of 41 of the iOS terms on the labels were widely misunderstood by users. When we went through all of the responses inductively, we found a lot of common misconceptions that showed up again and again. For example, in the case of the data type sensitive info, people tended to think that it included photos, social security numbers, mother's maiden name, credit card number, contact information, personally identifying information, passwords, phone numbers, and medical history, and a lot of things that they themselves would consider to be classified or sensitive information. Whereas in reality, it's simply like sensitive demographic information includes far fewer categories. Similarly, one of the purposes that the data is collected for that shows up on the privacy labels is developer communications. And there were 3 common misconceptions that kept showing up in this case. Firstly, people thought that this was information being shared from them to the developer. A lot of people thought that this was communications between different developers working on different apps. And a lot of people also thought that this was communications between different apps. Whereas in reality, it's simply news that comes from the developer to the user regarding the app. As previous research has shown, data used to track you is one of the iOS categories of data, and it is incredibly widely misunderstood in some ways that repeatedly show up. Firstly, people tend to think that it identifies what they're doing on the internet and tracks their internet activity. They think it's personal identification of them and the ways in which they use the app. And the word track is often misconstrued to mean location tracking, whereas it simply means any information that is linked to the individual or device and is used for targeted advertising. Our fourth example is app interactions, where there are two big misconceptions. The first of which is interactions, again, between different apps, and things like gameplay, likes, dialogue options. And it simply is just the way the user interacts with the app. And lastly, there's this category of other terms, which are just terms that include the word other in them, like the ones shown on the screen. iOS has 8 such terms, and Android has 7 of these terms. And these are incredibly widely misunderstood, with the question other than what kept coming up in our responses again and again. And with these terms, we also noted a much higher rate of responses that were classified as I don't know. And it was often also like misconstrued as referring to other users or other apps altogether. In order to quantify these results further, we conducted our second, more widespread quantitative study. And in this study, we had 383 participants. Again, we used Prolific to do it. And this time, the question type was multiple choice. Here's an example for account management. The way we created these questions is there would be a correct response, none of the above option, and I don't know option. And the incorrect responses were created based on the incorrect responses and common misconceptions that we found in the previous study. So in this case, data that is used by the app maker to help create or maintain your account, such as to help you log in or add information to your account, would be the correct response. But then we also included the common misconceptions, like people thinking account management meant tailoring the app specifically to a user's account, using the data from them, or data that is used to make sure that it's actually them using the account and not a different person. Through this study, we were able to see the proportions by which people misunderstood these terms and how they fell into the different categories. For example, in the case of developer communications, we see that 29.8% of people thought that this was information that went from them to the developer. 27.7% of people thought that this was communication between different developers, and only 2.9% of people thought that this was were used by the developers to make different apps work together. Similarly, with app interactions, 40.8% of people thought that this referred to how apps interact with each other, and 41.5% of people thought that it was gameplay, likes, dialogue options, and only 19% of people actually were able to get this correct and understand it. In order to remedy these common misconceptions that keep showing up again and again for so many users, we have several recommendations for how these data labels should be made. Our first recommendation is that these labels should use terms in ways that are consistent with their non-technical definitions. For example, data used to track you is super commonly misunderstood, but as a result of the diction of the word track, because people tend to think it refers to tracking their activity or tracking their location. So simply replacing this with something like data used for targeted advertising would be incredibly helpful to remedy that confusion. Secondly, privacy labels should avoid ambiguous terms and terms that have ambiguous syntax. For example, with the other terms that we just talked about, when a term like other app performance data is often misconstrued as like the performance data of other apps, just as a result of the way it's framed. So simply replacing this with app performance data, parentheses other, would really help alleviate that confusion. Thirdly, the terms used on these labels should be understood in isolation. One of the common misconceptions with the other terms is when people think that it's like anything other than what is already listed on the label. For example, in the broad category user content, there's a subcategory called other user content. And a lot of people assume that referred to audio data, because audio data didn't show up anywhere else on the label. Audio data is a completely separate term. So we think in order to get rid of that confusion, we should either have a hover feature wherein users could hover over these other terms, so it could explicitly tell them what exactly other is referring to. Fourthly, terms that capture a really broad range of values should be separated into smaller and more granular terms. For example, the term usage data, which was very poorly understood and very widely misunderstood, incorporates things like emails or texts, photos or videos, audio data,
and gameplay content, all of which were understood in isolation, but when put under the bracket of usage data was misunderstood. Therefore, we think they should be separated. And lastly, we think that in order to prevent the introduction of new misunderstandings when we replace these terms, all of the terms in the app privacy labels should be user tested before being published. Thank you. I can take any questions.